Well, I think I'd been interested in writing from a fairly young age, from the age of 7 or 8. Really, I showed a kind of propensity toward extended narrative, or toward being unable to finish my homework was how it looked to the teachers, because I would start a story and it would just go on and on and on. But eventually that started being encouraged in me, and I read a lot on my own, and it occurred to me at some point that one day I could write the kinds of books that I read. At the same time, I had it in my mind that writing was not a very lucrative profession, and I would need some kind of backup plan. And I think it was in the 9th grade, I read a book by F. Lee Bailey called The Defense Never Rests, which was essentially a storybook. It told the story of his cases, cases that were certainly as compelling, often more compelling than much of the fiction I'd read to date. And I saw, well, here was a lawyer who wrote books, and it seemed that was a good solution to my problem. That became my life plan, that I would go into law, and that would then allow me to be a writer as well. I've been to a lot of writing seminars. I've heard a lot of writers talk about their own trajectory as writers, and the one consistent thing is that they persisted. Almost everyone has a story like mine. Someone who told them, you can't do it, it's not worth doing it, you're undereducated, you don't have sensitivity to language, whatever. Whatever it was they were told, it was often a similar kind of discouragement or message that this was not for them, and yet they persisted. It was something they wanted, they went for it, and they went on to publish and become respected writers. And that seems to be the main distinguishing features between those who make it and those who don't. Those who make it are the ones who persisted. I wrote my first novel as a thesis for a master's program in creative writing, and up until then, in fact, I'd been writing a lot of short stories, and they were fairly experimental. I was sort of au courant with the current literary theory, and I was young, I was male. I wanted to be sort of at the cutting edge, part of the avant-garde of writing, and as a result, my writing was often quite sophomoric. I think it had more form than content, really, and it was also quite evasive. I think I believed at some level that anything that had happened to me was not really worth writing about, that my life was so insignificant and irrelevant that nothing good literarily would ever come out of it. And I was also someone who grew up in an immigrant family. My parents came from Italy in the 50s to Canada, and I'd always felt a certain kind of stigma around that. And I also felt that people who wrote out of immigrant backgrounds tended to get ghettoized as immigrant writers. They weren't real writers. They were just writing to sort of a minority group, their own immigrant group, and I didn't want to be categorized like that. My models were Shakespeare and Dostoevsky and the pantheon of world writers. I didn't see myself as writing out of some little narrow corner of this very sort of limited so-called ethnic experience. And as a result, I didn't write out of my own experience. With that novel was when I really started to delve into material that was familiar to me from my background. Now, that novel is set in Italy. I wasn't born in Italy. I was born in Canada, but it was set in an area that was based on my parents' home area, and I'd visited there and been quite taken with that region. In fact, the trips I'd made to Italy had been a real kind of revelation to me. The first time I went there, I think I was 12 years old, and I really hadn't understood at all what it meant to be of Italian background, and it just sort of opened up my sense of identity in so many ways. You're allowed to make things up, so I always make that clear to students when I'm teaching writing. If what you want to do is make things up, then by all means make them up. That's a large part of the pleasure of writing. It's a large part of the pleasure of reading, is entering worlds that you could not otherwise have entered. I do find that in order to get the depth that you want in a good piece of writing, you do at some point have to get access to your deeper self. Now, whether that's directly through your own experience or whether it's by analogy, X happened to me, and through that experience I can understand, how someone would feel in situation Y. I mean, I do a lot of that in my writing, sort of transposing by analogy. And I don't, I don't think of writing as a therapy, as a way to, overcome my childhood conflicts. I don't think of it as a way to somehow express myself or redeem my life, but I do think of my life as fair game. So anything that has happened to me, there, I have access to it. If I can use it as raw material, I'm willing to cannibalize it. I mean, a lot of critics have commented on the religious strain that runs through all of my writing. I mean, you can see it in the titles in the Book of Saints, which was actually called Lives of the Saints in Canada. My next to last novel, Testament, which was a kind of fictional or secular retelling of the life of Jesus. So it's been there all along, and all of my characters grapple with these questions. They grapple with the question of, are they Christian? What would it mean to be Christian? Is there a God? What would it mean if there wasn't a God? I mean, they're always asking the big questions about, what holds the universe together, and what are the meaning systems that you can actually put some faith or reliance in. Comes up again in a very strong way in my last book, The Origin of Species, which is coming out here in the States next spring, through the doorway of Darwin, who was really I think the sort of turning point in how we think of ourselves as human beings. And I think, I think the Darwinian revolution is one we are still living through. We're still in the throes of it. It's very difficult for us to let go of the sense that there is some kind of meaningful presence that guides the universe, and yet in a strict Darwinian view, there's no basis for believing that. So I don't try to solve these questions. I mean, I think it's literature's job to broach them and to live them in the way that people live them, in the way that we confront them, perhaps daily or perhaps yearly, or perhaps we never actually confront them. They just are this sort of noise at the back of our heads that we're afraid to turn to. I'm here as the Killam professor in Canadian Studies through the Canadian Studies department, and in fact the program here at Bridgewater is quite unique. I believe it's the only public institution that has this kind of endowment for this kind of position. And it's certainly a testament to the people at Canadian Studies here for the work they've done in establishing this program. And I think many universities in the U.S. are now stressing this whole idea of internationalism, and it makes sense that the places you ought to look to are your nearest neighbors. I think Canada is not well understood in the U.S. I think it's often thought of as either very similar to the U.S. or not thought of really much at all. And when in fact Canada is the U.S.'s major trading partner, and we have all kinds of interconnections and all kinds of things we can learn from each other, partly because of our similarities. I mean, there are things that we do well in Canada that I think the U.S. could learn from, and there's certainly things that you do well here that we can learn from. And that kind of interchange, I think, is really important in our time. It's a pretty iffy world out there. There's very little room for error now in terms of how you, say, develop technologies, in how you care for populations, in areas like medical care, which is certainly a pressing issue in the U.S. at the moment, but also in Canada. And I think it's crucial that we, particularly we who have great grounds for a sympathetic relationship, that we develop that. And I think that's not always done. And I think particularly a place like Massachusetts, which is so close to Canada, and I think within New England you tend to find a sensibility in particular that shares a lot of similarities with Canadian sensibility. There's a lot of room for exchange there. There's a lot of room for growing on both sides. So I think this kind of program is wonderful, and it certainly is great for me to be down here and to learn from that experience. And I think it offers the students here also an opportunity to learn from an outside point of view.